It's Monday, 10th of July, and I'm doing an oral history recording with Femi Otitoju. Femi, do you want to tell me a little bit about what your relationship to the GLC was?
My name is Femi Otitoju, and I worked at the GLC from 1984 to 1986, and I worked in two places. I worked initially in something called the Women's Support Unit for just over a year, and then for the latter part of my time there I worked in something that was intended to help run the campaign to save the GLC. So the team was called B10. We were in the basement in room 10, and we were employed by a consultant to fulfill our roles there.
Great. I'm just going to kind of try to get an understanding of the context and the background, your own background. So if you tell me a little bit about where you come from, your family, your relationship to London, and growing up here.
I was born in Nigeria, so my family are Nigerian, and I'm quite close to that culture. As a young black woman, I was at school in Hackney, where I was one of only two girls, I think, in my year who were black. Everyone else was white. Our school was half Jewish, so I have very strong allegiance with the Jewish communities. My school was very pro-feminist, so I was feminist by 16. We had little women's groups and things by the age of 16. I got involved in women's politics just before I left school. That would have been around 1977, where I just gave myself as a feminist, came out as a lesbian, and never looked back.
Amazing. So kind of what's happening for you in the late 70s, early 80s, as you describe your kind of political growth and movement, what kinds of things were you involved in?
In the late 70s, I was involved in the production of the London Women's Liberation newsletter, which we did pretty much by hand on old-fashioned bander machines. We turned the handle and churned them off. We licked stamps and literally typed newsletters and folded them and delivered them to several hundred women in London. I was a volunteer briefly on London Lesbian Line and a volunteer on London Lesbian and Gay switchboard, which I was part of for 13 years. For a little while I was chair of that organisation. I also got involved in the Women's Aid movement, so running women's centres and supporting women who were facing domestic violence. And I was just generally noisy on things like Reclaim the Night and campaigning against sex establishments. I was generally a pretty active feminist at that time.
And what kinds of people were you also involved in? The things you were involved in?
What was interesting, being a young black woman in the largely white middle class, a young black working class woman in the largely white middle class movement, was how hard it was to find women like myself. So in the early 80s we started the first black lesbian group here in London. I think I was members of that with someone like Jackie Kay, I think, came along to those meetings, and a few others. I was involved in the gay black group as well, which was the mixed group. And so the social part of it was just as important as the political part of it. In fact, the two were almost inextricably linked.
And kind of you described being active from a really young age, and having been born in Nigeria. And how old were you when you came here?
Oh, I was a baby. I came here.
Okay.
So I grew up in the south coast in Sussex.
Okay.
And then came to London in my teens. I came here when I was 6 months old.
Yeah. Okay. How did your family feel about your kind of political involvement?
Well, I think the reason I was able to be quite so politically active is that I was pretty much alone here. My mother went back to Nigeria in 1970, I think 7, the year I took my A-levels, leaving me with a 3-bedroom council flat, an income. My father was putting me through college, and total freedom. And I think that's one of the reasons why I, as a young black woman, was able to come out and be so high profile as a lesbian in a way that perhaps a lot of other young black women weren't able to at that time, because a lot of the family pressure pressures and community pressures that other young black gay people faced, and young black lesbians faced, I didn't have because mine was so far away. I mean, obviously in our communities, news travels fast, even across the water, so the things I was up to, my mother did get to hear about, but when all she can do is bellow at you down the phone, it doesn't make too much difference, it doesn't curb your activity too much. So my family didn't respond particularly positively to my political activism. Partly my mother had not had much, because my mother had not had much to do with politics while she was here. I'm not sure she even voted in the 20 years that she lived here the first time. But they weren't particularly bothered. I think they mapped the whole thing up with being English. Just thought the whole thing was just all connected somehow.
And how old were you when you came out, and what was that experience like?
So I came out at about 18, gradually, to my best friend, to the women in my CR group, to...
What's
CR is consciousness raising, and that's a gathering. Where feminists would get together and meet once a week and drink beer and fiercely agree with one another about whatever the feminist issues of the day were. We had self-exam groups and we discussed language and the patriarchy and how to destroy it, things like that.
Sounds amazing.
It was amazing.
So you went to university? No? Okay, well, that's really interesting. So you left school when you finished your A-levels?
I finished my A-levels and did all the things that you're supposed to do to go to university, so I filled in my UCA form and went off to all these places and found various universities, got offers from a couple, but I had just found feminism and loads of lovely lesbians in London, and there was no way I was leaving at all. And I was alone, in the country, so I kind of just sort of drifted a bit. I had this flat which I filled with women, all sorts of women who were hitching up and down the country and just looking for somewhere to be feminist and lesbian, so we hung there. It was 3 bedrooms, we could have 6 or 7 women at a time. I took up nursing for about 4.5 minutes because it was something I could walk into with just my A-levels and not have to do anything else, but it was horrendous. The most appalling thing that anyone could have suggested that I do, to be a young black woman in the NHS in the late 70s, just horrible. So I went from there and did medical laboratory science, and that was better. So my professional life is very, very different, not in any way connected to my personal life. So I worked there in laboratories for a while, didn't really like the NHS at all. So I walked into an agency, an employment agency, it was called Alpha Marks at the time, I think it's Adecco now, and said, this is what I've done, these are the A-levels I've got, I don't know what to do. And the woman said, well, you seem quite personable, would you like to work here? So I said, oh, all right. So I spent 2 years working in this employment agency, selling. I was very good at it, continued to be an activist. And then I sold space at a couple of other newspapers, and I was at the Observer when I got the call to action. Somebody rang me up and said, you're a likely feminist, we're looking for women like you to come and join the Women's Committee Support Unit of the GLC. Would you like to come with us?
I just wanted to take you back to the consciousness raising groups that you spoke about. What were the kind of things that you were discussing and reading and maybe debating or arguing?
Well, the first was about sexuality, the woman's right to define her own sexuality, obviously fertility and all related issues, the right to choice around abortion. We talked about consent and domestic violence. We talked about sexism, the mechanisms that put it into place and those that underpinned it. Unfortunately, probably much the same issues that any women's group would discuss today. I think the only difference between then and now was that now lesbianism is not really thought much of in terms of feminism. People don't go, why are the lesbians feminists? People kind of understand that, whereas the first feminist conferences I went to, we were still trying to get the right to define our own sexuality as part of the demands of the women's liberation movement. And some people felt that being lesbian detracted from the true feminist issues of the day. So I suppose that's a bit different from how it was then. consciousness raising groups were about just having a bit of space to be with women, and fewer voices to be the voices, as opposed to trying to find some space amongst male voices. It was also a space in which you honed your argument, so you've got to understand, even if at a gut level you understood it was important for women to have the right to choose, in your consciousness raising group you've got a chance to find out the best way to portray those arguments to others who disagree with you, to recognise the kind of resistance you like to come across and identify ways of dealing with it. So it was a real character building, skill building, argument developing forum, and every woman should do it. I think every girl should be put into a consciousness raising group as soon as she hits 16.
And what was kind of the makeup of people in the groups that you were in?
Well, the group I was in, the main consciousness raising group I was in, had a very wide spectrum of women. I was the only, there were 2 black women in my group, variously about 8 or 10 of us at any given time. Some of them felt phenomenally old, some of them were nearly 30. I mean, they just felt incredibly old to my 18 years. I went with my best friend from school. We had a woman from South Africa, we had some mostly middle class, we had a couple of women with children. I remember there being I think she was a Cypriot woman as well, and one single mother. It was a mix. Yes, it was a mix of women, different backgrounds, different ages, and of course different sexualities and ethnicities.
And how did kind of like class, race, gender kind of play out in that space or in the dynamics in the group?
The thing about a consciousness raising group is every woman is there because she wants to spend time with other women. The purpose of the group is to look at those issues of race, class and so on. Disability not so high on the agenda as I would put it now, if I'm putting a group together now. So what I remember is being very young, being wide-eyed, being variously shocked, appalled, intrigued, amazed every week at my consciousness raising group, and being supported and buoyed up and just looked after, not in a motherly way, but in a sisterly way by these women. So I was in a relationship which didn't go terribly well, and the woman kind of left and took loads of stuff from the house, and I was left without the television and vital things like a fridge, things like that. And I remember putting a note in the Women's Liberation newsletter, and I think by the end of the week I had 3 televisions and 2 sofas and everything, because that's what the movement was like at that time. There may have been dynamics around race and age and class that I wasn't sophisticated enough to see, because I was young and this was my first time in that forum, and there was no internet, and there was very little black feminist writing in the late 70s and early 80s. So to find that stuff, if you wanted a book from America, I mean, that was a huge deal. We were still writing on those little blue paper airmail letters. You sent that off, and it could be 3 weeks before you got a letter back. The idea of trying to get a book from America, or even knowing that there was a book in America that you might want to read by some black feminist over there, was very difficult. We had The Heart of the Race by Sarah Standig. That was in the 80s. So by the late 70s, there was very, very little around.
Is there any specific text that you remember?
Well, I just mentioned The Heart of the Race, but that came in the 80s. So I remember later, not in those late 70s, but obviously things like Audre Lorde was that, but mostly I read just ordinary feminist stuff, so Mary Daly, or and there was a few women around like Sheila Fletcher who very much affected my thinking, but mostly it was being around women, both socially and politically, which was just amazing.
It's going to sound like a really basic question, but I think as someone who's grown up with like the internet and emails as like kind of a main form of communicating and setting up Facebook event groups, how did you lot all communicate and know when to, agree when you were going to see each other and keep in contact?
How did we communicate? Well, there were telephones. They lived in the hall and they had wires. Most people had their telephones by their front doors, because coming into your house, so clearly it needed to be near the door.
Mm.
It's a very odd thing now. We take our telephones into our bedrooms, but in those days, telephones get by the front door because strangers came in through there. So we communicated by telephone. Mostly you did things regularly. So you said the CR group will meet on Wednesday evenings at so-and-so's house, and when you got to so-and-so's house, you agreed whose house it was going to be in next. You know, you just planned better. Just like your friend, if you're going to meet your friend at the cinema, you couldn't say, I'll text you. It wasn't there, and I'm sure there was many a time where some poor woman was standing outside the Odeon while somebody else was standing outside some other cinema. And it didn't feel too bad because it was all that we had, but I think that made that first Black lesbian group so much more precious when we managed to find each other, because you didn't have the everyday access to just even the thinking of Black women and Black lesbians that we have now.
I'm just going to take you back to kind of you describing when you first started to engage with the GLC. Just tell me a little bit about how that came
So
about.
one day I'm sitting in the offices of the Observer newspaper and I'm selling advertising space. And I get a phone call. We weren't really supposed to take phone calls at work, but I had a phone call and this woman said, the GLC is advertising for outreach workers for the Women's Community Support Unit. And they're going to want Black women and they're going to want feminists, and it's like you are a shoe-in. So, you know, I don't know where you are, but get up. So I applied for that job and I got it. And my life changed forever. Utterly forever. So I was one of 4 women. We were called outreach workers. Our task was to literally reach out to women in London. So I had ridiculously South London. I actually think that was a bit racist because I was given South London because I was the Black woman, even though I lived in North London. So that's a bit mad. Anyway, so there was one east, one north, one south, one west, and we had one Irish woman, one Asian woman, me. Who was the other one? Irish, Asian, me. And Monica, so a white woman. And our task was to work with community groups to support them in working effectively with women. That was it. I took balloons out and magazines and other GLC literature, and I helped them create appropriate applications for grant funding so that they could apply to the team that was run by Linda Bell. She was heading up the grants team at that time. It was the best job.
And so I'm wondering what your thoughts were of the GLC before you got the job, but obviously you applied, so...
Well, I knew about the GLC because I was a little activist, and in particular I knew about the GLC because they had funded the Lesbian and Gay Centre project, London Lesbian and Gay Centre project. I remember going along to an open meeting with this little man who was my friend, in fact 2 little men who were my friend. One was called Mark Ashton, and he was this tiny, tiny, beautiful man. And his best friend, who was the same size, a tiny, tiny, beautiful man, was called Jimmy Somerville. And I hung with them a little bit, which looked really weird. I don't know if you compare it to these 2 little white men and this really tall Black lesbian in the middle. And they took me to a meeting with the GLC in which we were discussing whether the GLC should fund this lesbian and gay, not Black, just the Lesbian and Gay Centre project in Cowcross Street, because they did fund it, and I was on the management committee of that. So I'd already thought of the GLC as being a good thing, being supportive of the different ways in which I was. I'd already seen some work, I'd heard Valerie Wise around the place and Kenya and Stone, so I felt positively about the GLC because it seemed to be speaking to all the ways that I was, all the things that were important to me.
Yeah. So you got funding for the London Lesbian and Gay Centre through the GLC, and how was the creation of that, the setting up,
The creation of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre was painful in many ways, because lesbians and gay men were not very used to working together cooperatively in London. I mean, there were pockets of good practice. I've been a volunteer on London Lesbian and Gay switchboard. We had, I think, 120 volunteers on that, of which 5 were women and 2 were black. So although, you know, I'm used to collaborating in groups where I am the minority, the Lesbian and Gay Centre was always male dominated. They tried really hard. But initially we had a couple of workers who did the feasibility study, and later on we got the full funding, and we tried to be all things to all lesbians and gay men. So we had a disco in the evening and a Women's Day, and we had a restaurant, and you know, also exercise classes. It was a fabulous thing, right in the heart of London, just off the Farringdon Road. And I think it lasted five years or so. I might not have that right, but for a while it was brilliant. Yeah, there were rows about everything. Everything. Oh, the S&M diets are coming in. That's awful. Oh, the gay men are doing poppers. That's awful. Oh, you know, everybody's racist. There were rows about absolutely everything. Nonetheless, it was an amazing resource. Absolutely phenomenal resource.
And at some point, as the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre was opened?
Then, initially, yeah, that was the thing. The Lesbian and Gay Centre was never really a true home for Black lesbians and gay men. Although a couple of black DJs had events there, it was never a place that felt like we belonged. If I think about the contrast of Black Pride these days. So the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project was initially housed by Haringey Council, that gave them space up near the town hall. We at Switchboard had started to support a black phone line, Black Lesbian and Gay phone line, because we weren't getting very many calls from black people, so we said, okay, we're going to have this phone line open one night a week. The bigger switchboard was open 24/7, so that black people would know that they could ring and they'd get a black person there. So having the response to that kind of showed that there was a need for some specific support. And so then the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project ran for 2 years and decided that there was a need, and so then we set about getting premises, and we finally got premises down in South London in Peckham, and yeah, we were there under the arches. And the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project ran counselling and socials, and that was another amazing space. It was physically quite a challenging space, being under the arches. You know, it was cold or over hot, and there was not very much natural light, but it was our space, and it was very precious.
I'm just going to kind of take you back to you starting to work within the Women's Support Unit. What was the space like? Where were you based? Where were your offices?
So I worked in the Women's Committee Support Unit. It was down on the ground floor. So you'd go into that amazing entrance into County Hall, and you'd hang a left, and then our unit would be just past the first corridor on the right-hand side. And just opposite us was the LBDRT, so the London Borough's Disability Resource Team, or the Disability Unit as it was then. So there's the Disability Unit on that side, then there was the women's unit just across the corridor there. There was a race unit that was up on the 2nd floor, and then on the 5th floor latterly there was something called 510G. 510G was the lesbian and gay unit. We never called it that. It was just room 510G.
Really? Why is that?
Well, because it was in the closet. It wasn't even out as a unit. It was just 510G.
Wow.
And 2 little lesbians lived up there. It was quite sweet. So I worked with the team who produced the women's newsletter, the Women's Committee Support Unit newsletter, which was a very fine document. Just trying to remember the name of the woman who did it. Helen Hewland produced that, and it was a very, very high quality publication. And then I got a car. That was exciting. In the GLC, in County Hall, they had a garage. It was underground. So you'd they gave us, me and the other 3 outreach workers, we all had a car, GLC car. I got this really lovely sort of metro, Austin metro, I think it was really cool. And they had a petrol pump. I mean, it was just the most exciting thing because, so I arrived at work and they went, here's your car. Here you go. It's a really nice, cool little car. There's the petrol pump over there. If anything needs doing, the men under there will do it for you. Take these leaflets, take these newsletters, take these balloons, off you go spread the word about the GLC to women in London. I had just an incredible task. So during the day, when I went into the office, I was surrounded by, I think there may have been at its peak, it felt like, and I can't be certain, it felt like there might have been up to 90 women in the Women's Community Support Unit. And it was one massive open plan office, and it was probably the most diverse, apart from somewhere like Parks or somewhere outside of County Hall, where they still worked for GLC, but they weren't in County Hall. But we looked like, apart from perhaps the race unit, an incredibly diverse unit. And we were less straight, if that makes sense. Not just straight heterosexual, but less straight, you know, our head of unit wore trousers. And it was colourful and messy and bold, and there were often children there, and it was very, very different from, you know, there was a bit of County Hall called the principal floor, which was the first floor, and if you were a junior officer, you weren't expected to walk around the principal floor. If you wanted to go to a room, if you were on one side of the principal floor and you wanted to go to a room on the other side, you weren't expected to walk around the corridor on that floor. You were expected to go down the nearest staircase, walk around the corridor, or go up the nearest staircase, walk around the corridor on another floor, and then return to the principal floor by the nearest staircase. So that, you know, there were only a certain grade of officer and elected members who were walking around the principal floor at any time. I never saw that written down anywhere, but people told me it a lot. So I was very bad and would walk around the principal floor, just for the hell of it. So it was still quite hierarchical. The unit was quite hierarchical. And that was quite difficult because you had all these old school feminists who'd been in collectives and cooperatives and so on, and we were all struggling with trying to fit into the hierarchy and the structures of the GLC. And there was some talk that we had let the side down, that we had somewhat betrayed the women's movement because we were being co-opted by the GLC. And some people say, you know, if I think about Women's Aid, when Women's Aid projects that I hung around were set up, I mean, they were set up from nothing, absolutely nothing. Nobody had anything. And so it was all the work that women could bring, our creativity, and this one would bring some cups, and this one could get, you know, spend 25 pence on that. And by the time, you know, the GLC came towards abolition, I think we'd forgotten how to do things that way, because we were used to getting money. And some say it destroyed a movement, that it hampered the movement, because we lost our ability to organise on a shoestring, and therefore became dependent on the state. And then with the money, of course, comes obligations. So some people thought, some women felt that those of us feminists that chose to work with the GLC and later other places in local government somehow sold out. I don't think we did. I know we didn't, because I know that as it became clear that we'd lost the battle, I was in effect made redundant from the Women's Community Support Unit, and they went straight into this B10, very big on calling units by their names, went down into the basement in B10, where I was just asked to continue doing exactly the same work as I've been doing before. And I won't mention the name of the person who said, your job now, between now and abolition, is to get as much as you can out of this building and into the community. Off you go. And we took that completely literally. So of course there was everything that was being made for consumption, like Save the GLC stickers and balloons and all this sort of stuff, guidance notes on how to run a group. But there was also reams and reams and reams of photocopier paper. And actually at one point, a photocopier out of the building, typewriters out of the building, because we didn't know what was become of them next. And those units existed to support the community. Disability groups, women's groups, lesbian and gay groups, older people's groups. And because we were all activists, we were all committed to trying to make that continue. And all around that time there was the miners' strike, and we were all trying to support the miners, which is where the story about Lesbians and Gay support the miners comes from. I remember we had collections in County Hall for the miners all the time. It was very exciting political times. And then came abolition. And I use this analogy a lot. It's like someone took a dandelion seed head that was just ready, it's all fluffy and just ready to go. It's just like when they abolished the GLC, it's like someone took that seed head and just gave them a mighty blow, and all the activists and all the troublemakers and all the lesbians and the gay men and the feminists and whatever just burst out over local government across the country. So instead of having one seat of unrest in County Hall, you now had all of us beavering away in local authorities up and down the country. And that's when you started to see a real shift in things like, certainly the establishment of lesbian and gay units, black units, women's units, proliferating all over local government. So Maggie did us a favour, really. Pretty cool.
I'm just going to take you a little bit back to what your day-to-day as an outreach officer was and what kind of projects you were doing and who and how you were engaging with the community.
My day-to-day work as an outreach worker at the GLC involved visiting groups, women's groups. So typically I would get in my metro, quite often metro, which I loved, and I would drive to County Hall and I'd go into the meeting, I'd have a meeting with the four officers. We would talk about what groups we'd visited in the last week and what we were going to try and visit this week, what publications had just come out and where we needed to get them to, and then we would pile loads of stuff, brightly coloured, beautifully laid out, documentation into our various cars, and then I would head south. And I would go to something like the massive Great Kidbrooke estate, and I would work with this mother and toddlers group and ask them what they would like to do that they couldn't afford to do right now. I would take loads of notes about how things were difficult for them, or I would go to the art centre in Deptford and put posters up on the wall and go and watch theatre by young women and talk about what they wanted to do that they couldn't do, and I'd give them their leaflets and I'd take those notes. And then I would drive back to County Hall and I would, sometimes I wouldn't go back that day, but I'd go to County Hall 2 or 3 times a week and meet with the other outreach workers and report back on what was going on in the community. Latterly, so that would have been the early part, as we got nearer and nearer to abolition, it became much more vociferous campaigning. So it was our job to produce the protesters, to stage things. Here's this woman who can't afford to take her 3 children on the bus because the fares are too expensive, so that can't do a fares fair campaign. We would make sure that people understood about legislative plans and what it would mean to them, and tell them when the meetings are going on so that they could decide to come along and lobby if they wanted to, tell them how to do that. Mostly it was about mobilising the community and informing the community on what was going on.
And what was kind of some of the highlights in terms of the kind of campaigning work that you were able to do?
My highlights were usually little events, so my aim was to get something on the news, so here is little Kieran and his mum Denise, and Kieran says he can hardly get on the bus now, can you, Kieran? Kieran's like 7 or something. I hate buses, they're always full and my mummy can't get on. So my task was to find those individuals, and that was the highlight, to get them on the news or something to show how things would get worse or weren't good enough because of the GLC not having enough money or not being allowed to make decisions in certain places. But other things were just about about supporting a group such that they, there's this family group over here, completely unfunded, trying to help one another with military daycare, and I get them to the point where they can help complete a grant application to in a state, which means that they're likely to be able to get funding. That was amazing work. But that changed the lives of small children and their mothers.
Yeah.
It was great work. And that's work I was doing at 24, 25. It's a big job for a little girl.
What were some of the difficulties that you faced?
Well, the biggest difficulties that we faced working for the Women's Community Support Unit in the GLC, I think, were that people who were outside of our movement would ridicule the work that we do. So we constantly see articles in the newspaper about the GLC funding lesbian self-defence groups, and we did fund a lesbian self-defence group, and it was absolutely essential that we did, because lesbians got attacked on the street and they needed to learn how to do self-defence. The challenges was that, we were the loony left. I was the walking loony left. And so anywhere you went, from within my own friends sometimes, well, family more than friends, to other social environments, people were criticising the initiatives that we took. And of course there was also the fight in the left against separating racism out or women's issues out from the wider class struggle. So on the one hand, you're being vilified because you're lefty, and within the left you're being vilified because you're a feminist or because you're a black activist or because you're lesbian or whatever. So
Some things never change.
yeah, and we didn't even have the word intersectionality, so it was particularly difficult because you couldn't even talk about what was going on because we didn't have the language for it. We talked about multiple oppressions. And that gave the impression that everything just piled one on top of the other, and not that there was, that it's more nuanced than that there are overlaps and where, so if you're a black woman, yes, you face sexism and you face racism, but if you're a middle class black woman and you've got quite a lot of money, you can leave some of the effects of racism behind because you hang out in places where, if you throw enough money at it, no one's going to treat you badly at all. So I think that some of that wasn't understood in the way that it is today, and it wasn't easy to articulate that either. In fact, I don't even know that so I'm walking around as a working class black lesbian, so you've got woman in there as well. I don't think that I could have put a sentence together, or even a paragraph, that could describe the way in which those things intersected. Even if I'd sat down by myself for a long time, I'm not sure that we got it enough for us to recognise what was going on there.
You spoke a bit about what it was like kind of within County Hall and the relationships around kind of like hierarchy and things like that. So I'm just like interested in what was instituted within the workplace that was different, new, that was coming from kind of the politics and discussions you'd been having in your consciousness raising groups.
So, working at County Hall, on the first hand, for me, was a massive cultural change because I had to work with elected members, senior lifelong officers, lifelong, not quite civil servants, but in effect, local government officers, men. I'd never worked around so many men close on, because even if you're in the health service, there's so many women in the employment agency world, that was nearly all women. And even though I worked in the newspaper, in advertising, in the lower levels, you get almost entirely women. So I get into County Hall, the men are in charge, and I was a bit shocked by that, so that was quite hard. It was quite hard, the processes that you had to go through, because it was a big machine, so that was interesting. And then the biggest thing, I think, was the politics, where something may not necessarily be the right way to do it, but it has to be done that way because it was politically astute to approach something in that way. So, for example, we might say that we're actually going to not picket for the survival of that hospital, even though the local people want it. We think it's important that that women's hospital stays, but because the local councillor has this role, you know, on the GLC, we can't go and criticise it because we're employees of that. So I had to add a whole level of politics, the capital P, to my personal politics, and that was interesting and somewhat challenging. Yeah. We got there, you know, it just took us a little while.
I've kind of read and heard lots of things about what it was like within the women's support unit. You know, kind of what were some of the conversations, the debates that you were having, the ways in which you were trying to bring your own kind of knowledge and understanding into that space?
It was interesting because initially the women's support unit was headed up by a woman called Louise Pankhurst, which I just thought was a brilliant name for the head of the women's unit. But, you know, very white, very middle class, not actually probably an old school feminist in the truest sense. And so trying to bring some working class feminism into that was quite challenging. Also, I think just trying to bring some race politics, so we were constantly going, you know, are there any black women involved in this? How do we get the black women's voice across that? How do we get disabled women's voices into this arena? And some people just saw that as divisive, so those were some of the conversations we were having there. We were also talking about whether or not we were prepared to align ourselves, you know, wholeheartedly with the left. And then some people just thought we shouldn't have any politics because, you know, we were officers and officers weren't supposed to bring their own, you know, because officers are supposed to survive the politicians won't come and go with the vagaries of the elections and the like, but the officers are supposed to be able to keep their post. So we were a rather odd little place because of course we were all recruited, or so many of us. One or two kind of transferred over from other bits of the GLC, but most of us were recruited because of our politics. And then once we got there, we were told that our politics had no place in the way in which we did the work. How does that work then? And we took no notice of that, obviously. So to just carry on being who we were. So it was not surprising, therefore, it was quite an emotional place to work. There were loads of lesbians anyway, so that caused lots of hassle because, you know, women were in all kinds of relationships with one another, which made things slightly complicated. But you were also, you know, constantly running up against someone who just, the difference between radical feminism and socialist feminism, which a lot of other people just wouldn't have got at all, was enough to kind of make us feel like we couldn't work together sometimes on a project. So, you know, we're dealing with all of that. We were still finding our own language, so we were battling over whether we should be talking about heterosexism or homophobia, things like that.
I'm just interested in what were the relationships like between the different units. So you have like the race unit, or race and ethnic minorities unit,
Yeah.
and you have the women's support unit. But then I wonder where for you, you're doing work over here, but also you're a black woman. And so how did you engage?
One of the most disappointing things about working in the Women's Security Support Unit was the lack of collaboration between us and the Race and Ethnic Minorities Unit. We should have been natural allies, and I think actually sometimes we were pitted against one another. And it was male dominated, and I think they found it difficult to deal with women a bit. I personally never engaged effectively with the Race and Ethnic Minorities Unit. I tried a few times, but my remit was women and they were mostly men, so that was quite hard, really. I remember, I mean this wasn't in the GLC, but it was in the GLC Times. I remember rushing to a meeting once late and apologising and saying, sorry, I couldn't miss this meeting, and I remember some guy saying to me, you know, one day you're just going to have to make up your mind whether you're black or whether you're a feminist. And I remember thinking, okay, that's the problem. That's exactly what makes it almost impossible. And actually, oddly, the strongest affiliation I had was with the disability unit. across the way. It might be because they were geographically nearer. But the women in there were strong and effective, and so yeah, we found a natural ally there. And then of course, as I said, we had 510G up on the 5th floor, who were working. They produced a couple of publications. One was Tackling Heterosexism, which is a training publication, and the other, I'm going to get what the other one was called, Changing the World. It was called Changing the World, and it was a publication setting out good practice for local authorities around lesbians and gay men, and we collaborated with them on that. I do not remember collaborating with the Race and Ethnic Minorities Unit on any publication at all.
And 510G was the,
that was the
Lesbian and Gay group. Yeah.
Hence Tackling Heterosexism. Yeah, that was the language thing I was saying, that we were constantly arguing about our language. That was lovely in a way in the Women's Committee Support Unit, in that we did have those conversations about whether, you know, we referred to one another as ladies or women, or whether we talked about heterosexism or homophobia, and just all of those, all the stuff that I was good at because I'd learned it all in my consciousness raising group. But yeah, that's where those discussions were held. I don't think they've been held in the local government before. You know, we really did bring the grassroots movement into the town hall. It was amazing.
And what kinds of things was 510G, or the Lesbian and Gay group, working on? So you've described these two.
There were two of them, these two workers. Well, they were producing good practice guidance, as I say, Tackling Heterosexism, which was about creating positive working environments, and this Changing the World, which was basically about provision of services, amongst other things, but also looking at the political processes. They were collaborating with ILEA, the Inland London Education Authority, on, you know, good practice for schools. There was only two of them, so limit to how much they could do. But yeah, quite good stuff. We weren't supporting lesbian and gay pride by then particularly, when I first started there, although that came later, and in quite a big way. We had the fire service at the GLC as well, so that was kind of part of it. So we were looking at the way in which they worked, so we were doing things like encouraging them to take on women firefighters. We were funding projects that just basically allowed women to get into things like the wet trades, into plastering and bricklaying, and fields where we weren't very well represented, into all of the building sector and so on. My focus was less about the politics and more about the supporting and building the community, because I believed that the voluntary sector could do so much more, and the women's movement could be so much more if it had greater resources. And I saw the GLC as kind of our pool of money, big pool of money.
How did the GLC stand up to kind of like practicing what was being produced by the groups like 510G around kind of, you know, best practice within the workplace? And so, and I'm imagining like Race and Ethnic Minorities Unit also producing things around like racism. So how did that play out within? My sense of how well we were kind of living our own values was that we weren't doing it terribly well at all.
I know there were accusations of racism within the Women's Committee Support Unit. I know that black and minority ethnic people, like still today, are not supported at the lower levels of the whole of the GLC. I know that we were used, we and the Race and Ethnic Minorities Unit were used as a kind of place of sanctuary, so people would come into the offices just to be somewhere where they could talk about what they thought they were facing in other departments. I don't think our house was in order particularly, and I don't think many of us expected it to be. I think we had our eyes on a bigger prize, which was to change local government as a whole, not just our institution. That became more true when it became clear that abolition was on the cards. We stopped worrying about what we were like, what we were doing. The main focus, what we were like ourselves, the main focus became on either trying to help us survive or trying to make sure that the good practice got out to other places. The idea even of the good practice, even if not actually it. Yeah. That was one sad thing, is that we never really got that right, I don't think.
Is there any like specific, you know, like memories or incidents that you can remember?
I don't remember any specific incidents. I remember an accusation when there were two heads of units. So Valerie Rise left, and then two women took over as joint heads of the unit. Their names are not going to come. Shirley, somebody. The black one was a lawyer. Maybe they were both lawyers, actually. And then one of them ended up being ousted and the white one ended up being the head of the unit. And I know there were some real accusations about, you could have just guessed that was going to happen regardless of what people's performance was like. Whatever, you just knew that there was no way they were going to let a black woman be the head of that unit. And that was pretty much what it was like. You could never put your finger on it exactly. Who knows what we didn't know about, you know, the relative performance of those two women and the merits and what they were after, but you know, that was constant. You know, you look at who was appointed where, and you could, yeah, that's just more of the status quo.
Mm.
Those names would be easy to find.
Yeah, definitely come up. You spoke earlier.
Deborah Worsley. Deborah Worsley was the white one. I think the black one was Bev something, but I can't get any closer than that. And that's typical. Great, I remember the white one's name.
You spoke earlier about how the wider feminist movement felt about people going to work within the GLC, and about that being like a betrayal of some sort of your politics. So during this time, like, what is happening in the wider movement, and kind of how were you engaging with it?
Whilst those of us who've opted to go and work in the GLC are being accused of having sold out, in the wider movement, women's centres are being set up. They're not very clean because the feminists don't want to do the housework in them, but they are there. Women's centres are being set up. Women are collaborating in the arts, a massive blossoming of women's arts actually, and black minority arts while we're at it. Oh, and LGBT stuff. So we see things like the Drill Hall being given over to, you know, pretty much as a Lesbian and Gay Arts Centre. We see the Arts Centre in Deptford and Greenwich Dance Centre, and projects that are funded by the GLC. We are reclaiming the night, and we are basically just making things that we thought, things that were the feminist aims, we're making them ordinary. So things around the equal pay, they're campaigning around the equality legislation is all kind of gathering momentum. And that's the thing that, you know, that paves the way for things like the Disability Equality Act that comes much later, you know, comes later in the 90s, but you know, but I think the seeds are sown at this point. I, for example, am part of a project that's taking away, I think we took away 22 disabled people from 3-day residential courses to turn them into disability equality trainers who could go out and train in local authorities. We're basically growing activists at this time. We're just helping everybody grow up in a political way. It's lovely. It is lovely. We're helping people see that they can shape what their local authorities are doing, that they can be part of it. We're opening it up to working class people in a way that it hadn't been before, really. You know, there's always a few who knew how it worked, but just that everybody, you know, could be part of it. Now we're making sure everyone can see how they can make it do the things they want it to do. Yeah, so I'm seeing, so we've got the arts, we've got the women's centres, we've got the black community centres. So, I mean, at this borough here, which is Haringey, we're ending up with the West Indian Community Centre, the Asian Community Centre, the Greek, the Cypriot Community Centre. I mean, the community, you have one for everything, pretty much. It's brilliant. And some of those have survived.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering now, like, obviously there's like the politics of the day and the debates and in the women's liberation movement at that time. Like, when you look back on that, what has like changed about your politics that you weren't really aware of at the time?
Well, when one looks back, I think the thing I notice most of all is my confidence, my conviction, my belief that I can make things happen. That in terms of the politics of the day, what's changed is that things that were seemed revolutionary at the time, like that you should say if you want to supply us with goods, you must make sure that you've got an equality policy. You know, those kinds of things is just taken as read, whereas before there were big arguments about contracts compliance and whether or not we were going to be allowed to do that. I think things like equality impact assessments, the idea that before you put something into place, you think about how it's going to affect the different protected groups, like how's it going to affect different racial groups or different age groups and so on. That's just part of the way in which things work now in local and central government, and that's just amazing. We used to have these equality considerations, which was basically 2 paragraphs at the end of every report that went to committee, and usually people wrote there are no equality considerations attached to this report, and then they'd say we're going to knock down this housing estate or whatever it is, and they would say, claim somehow that wasn't going to affect women differently from men. So when I look back, things that were extraordinary, and some of them just stuff we kind of just dreamed about, are now not just ordinary but required. So we have to remind ourselves of things like that when it feels like it's all going to hell in a handcart at the moment. That actually we've come a tremendous long way, and it's not going to be easy to undo it because some of those changes are now enshrined in legislation. You know, the need to do an equality impact assessment. It'll take quite a lot of time to dismantle it. And that shores me up when I start to feel a bit tired. Yeah, we made a lot of change.
Yeah.
It's great.
What about kind of like your thoughts on some of the debates that were happening? Like, I've found it really, really difficult to understand the debates around like S&M stuff. I'm like, oh wow, I can't, like, when I think about it now, I'm like, oh, I can't. It's so interesting, the things that are, yeah, like a huge deal, and I wonder how people see them now.
I think those debates around things like S&M and of course the trans issue are still raging. I think that, I mean, I was really clear about S&M and about, you know, you don't allow people to consent to be harmed. But I think that it was right that those debates took place. We still want to have them. I don't think that's just going to stop. Why would it stop? Because every time, you know, things have to continue to change. Everybody new comes to their own awakening and goes and looks at the thing that you thought you had sorted in a fresh new way and says, well, hold on, I need us to revisit this discussion about transracial adoption and fostering. You know, we've gone from, we must, obviously white people adopt white people and black people adopt black people, and we've gone from that, well, the beginning was of course that white people could adopt whoever they liked and black people couldn't adopt anyone, and then we've gone from that to, okay, we must do culturally sensitive placement and adoption, and so now only black people can have black people, only white people can have white people, and now we're kind of back round again. So I think that it's a cycle. It's healthy that we continue to revisit those issues, and the day that we decide we've come to the final conclusion, we're in trouble.
Yeah. I'm kind of like interested in what's going on for you personally. We've kind of spoken a lot about like the work and, you know, what you're doing and like what's your life like outside of...
So I'm working at the GLC. When I'm not in my little Austin metro, I'm cycling around London. At a time when it felt safer, even though there was less provision. I live in this sort of feminist bubble, nearly separatist, in that the postman comes to the door, but that's probably about it by way of men. I spend every waking minute working for women, either paid work or voluntary work. So all lesbians and gay men, all black people. So I'm a living activist. So I'm running from producing the newsletter to answering the phone at Switchboard to doing a shift at Women's Aid to going to learn how to look after my bicycle because you have to go to bicycle maintenance or car maintenance, or you're going to plumbing courses because that's the thing that women do, and then you're looking for somewhere to do which things. Someone tried really hard to get me into creative writing because we believed it was important to create our history. That didn't work, but I did write, one-off articles for things like Outright and Spare Rib and Outrage, which was the lesbian one. I was a columnist for Capital Gay, so I wrote a column once a month for the gay newspaper. Life was crazy, and we partied hard, and even that was political. So you go to this club, there'd be no women, you'd have to go and tell the club person there's no women in the club, it's terrible. Or I'd turn up at a club which is a gay club and the bouncer would say to me, it's not soul night, what are you doing here? So then I'd have to go and start all this nonsense again about black people. It was constant, and in the meantime you're putting super glue in the lots of sex clubs, doing graffiti, and then I had to get a dress to wear to the Lesbian Strength March every year because I always wore a dress to Lesbian Strength because you couldn't wear a dress to Gay Pride because the drag queens was always outdress you, so there's no point in that, So it was a phenomenal time, that late 70s, early 80s, right up to abolition happened in 1986. It was just a whirlwind of political and politically motivated social activity. Yeah, and there were so few black feminists who had a high profile that you had to constantly go into all these different fora and remind them about the black women's issues all the time. Constantly saying that.
Who were the prominent black feminists?
Well, there were American feminists that we all read. And there was Linda B, who ended up being leader of Landlord Council. There were the group over at Southall, so the Southall Black Sisters, who were doing the most phenomenal work. Pragna Patel is still there, still going strong, still doing that. And then for me, that was about it. There was the lot over, now pointing east, because Southall Black Sisters were in the west, so now pointing east, which is where the Outright Collective were based. So they were producing that newspaper, the women's newspaper. There were some black women involved in Spare Rib. But, I'm sure I couldn't even name them.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, I guess I've learnt and read lots about groups like OAD, which are all kind of happening in Brixton, and wondering what your relationship to...
Well, OAD mostly did the conferences, the Organisation of Innovation and African Descent. And that was great, but for me OAD wasn't such a great place because I was out as a lesbian and that didn't feel desperately comfortable, and the Brixton Black Women's Centre had to be persuaded to allow the Black Lesbian group to meet there. So they were going on, but they weren't, for me the sisterhood wasn't as strong as it might have been. Because I came out as a lesbian almost as soon as I came out as a feminist. So if I couldn't bring my whole self to the space, then I couldn't be in the space. And I remember it was an OLAD conference at which we started the first Black Lesbian group because somebody said, there's going to be a workshop on Black lesbians. I don't know where we were, Starcross Street, somewhere like that. And then somebody else said, oh, no, it's not on Black lesbians, it's for Black lesbians, in front of the whole room. And then it just all got really nasty when we started saying, throw them out, mash them up, kind of really horrible. So we all snuck off quietly to this meeting, that was in this room that we were really worried, therefore we're going to get this negative response to. We didn't, and I mean, nobody hassled us, but we'd had that difficult response in the first place. And that's when we agreed we needed to meet regularly. So actually the first Black Lesbian group grew out of an OLAD conference, but not for the right reasons, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And then how did you go on to kind of sustain that group? Or how did
We just met regularly. At one point I remember some woman saying, those of you who think you're only going to sleep with Black women, you better look around the room because this is all you've got to choose from. We were all thinking, oh, perhaps we should widen the group. We advertised through the newsletter. Women came from all over the country to our sort of every 6 week or so meeting. We went out and met isolated women, so some of us would we would write to the group and say, I can't get to you, and we would go off as a little posse and go and meet them. I remember meeting some 70-year-old Black women who were just older Black lesbians, so exciting. So we were very supportive of one another, And then gradually we made our way into the women's centres, especially the Black women's centres, and gradually we accepted. It just took time.
Yeah.
We had to feel confident before we were bold enough to, almost, not quite demand the space, but just take it.
Is the term Black being defined within those groups?
Well, there were all sorts of fights about what a definition of Black should be. And I remember in the Black Lesbian and Gay group, we had a woman called Zambian who was a formidable intellect, and she helped us pin ours down, but she suggested that we borrow things that we used in other places. So Black was being defined in the broadest possible way. So someone who is descended through one or both parents from the indigenous peoples of Africa, Asia, Australasia, the Americas, the islands of the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. So we had this really wide, inclusive definition of that, and we started with a capital B.
And what was the relationships between people who were coming from all these different, vastly different kind of cultural...
At the time of the GLC, it wasn't too bad, the relationships between all these people coming from these different backgrounds, because we weren't used... we were not dividing up terribly. We were all happy to march under that banner. Later, it became a bit more sophisticated, and we started talking about Black and ethnic minorities. We talked about ethnic minorities rather than minority ethnic as we do now. And we, later on then, the Mayor's office, for example, today uses BAME, Black and Asian minority ethnic. But at that time, we all just, even the Greek Cypriot people came and marched under the banner of Black. That was good. It's about a shared experience rather than a shared identity. I think that's what Black meant in those days. Now it's more about an identity. And of course we didn't, I keep saying we didn't have the internet, so we didn't have such a strong affinity with what was going on in the US as we do now. Our struggles become one struggle, so in the US we hear Black Lives Matters and we're instantly on it. Whereas over here we were talking about Black people, and in the US they were talking about people of colour, and we'd already eschewed coloured people, so we weren't about to embrace that one very easily. And because we didn't interact very much, we weren't so influenced by that. So we had to fight to make our own journey to the term Black. And I think it was a good one. I think it was a warm, open, embracing definition which highlighted our shared struggle, our shared challenges, our shared experience in a way that Black and minority ethnic doesn't really.
I guess what's happening for you? So Margaret Thatcher's in power, Ken Livingstone is head of the GLC. What kind of were your thoughts and views of, and John McDonnell is he's the Chancellor now. I forget what the term was, but he did all the finances, right?
Yeah.
What kind of were your thoughts of the leadership of the GLC, and also how were you interacting with the wider kind of political, conservative government in place?
Well, of course, it was very simple. We worked in the GLC, which meant we hated the government, because the government was completely at odds with the GLC, and the government hated us. So, Margaret Thatcher was the devil incarnate. That was all very simple. What was less simple was Ken Livingstone. He was a clever man, and he was a really good politician. And he, more than John McDonnell, was widely, kind of well regarded, I think, within the women's support unit. I certainly found the man charming. As a feminist, I've always called myself a radical feminist. As a lesbian, as a black woman who, I had no interest in white men, put it simply. I had no interest in white men at all. I worked with them as part of Switchboard, but they were nothing in my life at all. And so for a man like that to make me think, that's a good man. You can see that he trod a path carefully. He was skilled.
Mm.
I feel he has become less skilled over the years, which is a pity. But at the time of the GLC, he was a man who genuinely persuaded people that he was on their side. Whether their side was woman, feminist, black, whatever, and so in a lot of his actions he showed that, because I don't remember a time when I was part of a group that wanted something from the GLC that didn't get it. So that said a lot. They were, as far as I was concerned, the politics were open, up front, and completely aligned with all things I believed in, including supporting us around, troops out, the miners' strike, all that sort of stuff. I was completely engaged with the sorts of the GLC. Internally, I knew that there were machinations, but they were just, as far as I was concerned, they were the white men having trouble, nothing to do with me.
Kind of like looking back at that time, what for you is like the most significant thing that you were involved in or part of through the GLC, or the kind of like legacy of that time?
The greatest legacy of that time was the proliferation of women-run organisations that were well-resourced and just everywhere. Every borough had a women's centre. Some had 2 or 3. There were childcare, the projects which released women to work and do other things. That was an incredible legacy, which was never taken away because the expectation has always been there now that it would be there. There's been other providers of it, but that was the legacy. So I think it was genuinely contributing to the liberation of women. Absolutely. No 2 ways about it.
And you spoke a little bit earlier about the problems on creating dependency through funding. Can you just kind of elaborate on that?
So the GLC funds all these women's projects, and so the women's projects can recruit workers, so they're bigger and more effective. But then they become used to functioning with paid workers. So then when we approach abolition and the funding starts to dry up, and it doesn't dry up immediately after abolition, there's they called it the LSPRM, or London Strategic Policy Unit, and the London Residuary Body. So these are the 2 things that kind of live on afterwards. So those organisations that have been funded by the GLC limp on for a little while with little bits of funding. And that's almost worse, because you don't go, oh, we're going to be abolished tomorrow. Everybody fight, let's fundraise, let's do this, because all our energy goes into that. It's that if we do this right, we might keep our funding in. If we do that right, we might keep our funding. So all that energy goes into keeping this little bit of money and this little bit of money. So the problem is that by the time we've gone, we're tired, and some of us have leached away from the organisation, and there's not enough money left. The entity's still there, but it's harder to be with so little than it was before. What's that thing about you don't miss what you haven't had? So we haven't had the money, so we were okay. When we were used to being funded, it was more difficult. So there was the expectations of the services without the money. So I think there's a bit of a dip before we picked ourselves back up again after that, which is a shame.
And you said that you took on a particular role around the time of abolition or before abolition. Can you say a little bit about that?
So the GLC is a public body, so I think they weren't allowed to do upfront campaigning. So there was an agency, a consultancy, I think it was called Paul Walmsley Associates. And Paul Walmsley must have just been given a big chunk of money and been told, run the campaign. So us campaign officers, us Women's Committee Support Unit officers, went down into the basement to join B10, which had men in it. But anyway, so we joined this wider campaign, and our task was to shore up the political campaign, so the upfront political campaign, to shore up by sort of agitating the community, that wider campaign, by kind of getting them to get involved with initiatives, protests, whatever else, and to get the money out. It's a bit naughty. It was great. So I was a paid activist, basically. It was like the stuff that I would have done before and would do today for no money at all, but somehow they've managed to get this consultancy to take it on.
And so B10 was the campaign to save the GLC, yeah.
And B's the basement.
Yeah.
So just down there. Loads of us, all kinds of grungy activists.
And how did like the wider communities feel about the fact that the GLC was going to be abolished?
Well, you know, it depends what end of the political spectrum you were in as to how you felt about whether the GLC should be abolished or not. You know, if you were a woman with any consciousness, and if you were a minority ethnic person or a lesbian or gay man or an old person or a disabled person or whatever, you thought the GLC was a jolly good thing, which is why Ken had been able to stage the coup in the first place. You know, because it had a very wide appeal. But if you were a raving Tory, and some of the gay men were, to be fair, then obviously you thought the GLC was frittering people's money away and completely bonkers. So we just made sure that we stayed in, you know, that we understood where some of our support would come from and campaigned furiously over there. It was very simple division, you know, do you benefit from what it does or don't you? And you just kind of said where you were. But, you know, there'd be a few people who politically thought it was important to do right by people who were disadvantaged, but mostly, with those of us on the sharp end, thought it was important that the GLC survived. And it's not very different from the way politics are now in 2017, I think, 2017. I don't think it's very different at all.
And like, just for you, how did that time shape who you are today, and how do you feel about it now?
My time at the GLC and that entire period, so not just when I was at the GLC, but everything that I did in the late 70s and early 80s, gave me the voice, the ability to use the voice, gave me the language that I have today. That time gave me the confidence, it gave me the space to develop my thinking. And the GLC gave me belief that things could be better and that the establishment could be part of making it better. And the GLC helped me make the business that I have at the moment. So the consultancy, the Equality and Diversity consultancy I have at the moment, exists because I understood that you could persuade people to do things better by skillful negotiation and education. And the GLC paid me to do that at that time, and now private companies pay me to do it.
And how do you now kind of relate to the criticisms from the wider women's liberation movement, in terms of that feeling that there were some people selling out, or that, yeah, I guess like the establishment is not where change can happen?
I have a lot of empathy for women who said that feminists were selling out. I think some of us, you know, we were paid to do. You know, I became a professional feminist and a professional lesbian in plenty of ways about it. I think that the mistake that some of those women made was that they believed that we didn't mean our feminism anymore. That we took the money to do it, and therefore we didn't believe in what we were doing anymore. And that was unfair. That wasn't true. You know, if you're an artist and someone pays you to paint a picture, that doesn't mean to say you don't believe in your art anymore. And it's possible that an artist will get paid to do some commercial art that they don't believe in. But we feminists went to work for GLC We weren't like that. We weren't being paid to do something we didn't believe in. We got paid to do the stuff we would have done for nothing anyway. We got paid to do the stuff. Me running around women's groups, getting them to campaign in order to get a fair bus tariff. I would have done that anyway. Running around taking newsletters to women, telling them about their rights or helping them put on assertiveness classes, I would have done that anyway. So I think it wasn't fair to say most of us had sold out. But I can understand why they questioned why some of us were getting paid to do it and some weren't.
I guess just like to open it up, if there's other things that you would like to say about your relationship with the GLC, and then I'll be interested in kind of what you went on to do after abolition.
I think the GLC was an amazing period in our political history, the span of it, when Ken Livingstone ran it in that short time. I think the GLC changed the face of local government permanently and for the better, and put equalities on the map in a way that no other organisation got anywhere close to doing. I think I went on to work for the London Borough of Haringey and the Lesbian and Gay unit, the first Lesbian and Gay unit in the country, only made possible by the GLC. The GLC held the first register for same-sex partnerships. You know, they changed the lives of lesbians and gay men and paved the way for gay marriage. I know the Tories like to claim that they did that, but you know, that was, it's everything from the bikes to the gay marriage. That was the GLC. That was Ken Livingstone. That was his baby, if you like. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. So I went to the Haringey Lesbian and Gay unit, where sadly Section 28 started. That's a whole other story. And then I left Haringey in 1988, and I have since then run my own business. And I owe my ability to do that to 13 years of London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard and the time that I spent at the GLC.
Kind of when I was telling you about the project, I was kind of explaining that lots of younger people, and certainly like people who are organising, who are activists, don't know about the GLC. Why do you think it's been forgotten? What does it mean to you that that erasure has happened?
I think one of the reasons the GLC has been forgotten is simply that the archives would have had to be hard copies. You know, these days it would be all over the internet and it would pop up every time. It would be like the Daily Mail website, and you'd only be 3 clicks away at any given time. And I think that it's a shame that its history is hidden. I think that one of the reasons the GLC has gone is that the government at the time was determined to try and erase its legacy, which is why the building, I thought, was sold off with undue haste, and to, I just think it was immoral to sell that building to owners outside of the country. And I don't feel very nationalistic, but I do feel like some things should belong here to the people. So I think that's another reason why the legacy hasn't stayed. And I think some people don't want to acknowledge that the things that they call the results of their activism and the things they see as the fruits of their labour actually came to fruition because of the GLC. It's hard to give acknowledgement to the politicians, but in the case of the GLC, I believe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's definitely my interest in kind of doing this project and setting up this project was to hear people talking about an institution with such joy and like to have such, I mean, I can't think of any institution that I've grown up with that I could speak of in that way, which kind of brings me to my question of what are your views of city level democracy now and what like the Greater London Assembly is?
Well, I think the Greater London Assembly has been quite a bit disappointing. I think civil level democracy is a bit of a problem at the moment. I think the current government's tactic of devolving power to some of the local government is basically just a way of tricking people into blaming those local authorities for austerity. I think that the soul is missing from city level politics at the moment. the GLC put the party into party politics now. They really knew what they were doing. And I don't think we've seen anything like it since.
Is there anything else you would like to put on record?
I'd like to say, you know, if I ever had enough money, I'd buy County Hall back. It's still uncomfortable for me to walk past it and see it as a hotel and an aquarium and so on. And I think that the GLC did create some local councils that were wonderful, and so we mustn't think that its legacy was entirely lost.
And which ones would you look
I
to?
think Manchester Council, I think Camden and Haringey, I think Leeds, and to an extent Birmingham, places where the spirit of equality and inclusion continued long after the abolition of the GLC.
Yeah.
Glasgow.
Glasgow,
Glasgow.
yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think we're ready to end the recording now, if that's okay with you.
That's fine with me. I hope there's stuff there you can use.